In the early 1980s, appearing on Top of the Pops could make a career overnight. It was the single most powerful stage in British pop. Yet at the height of their success, Madness managed to do something almost no chart act ever risked. They embarrassed the BBC on its own programme. A hidden message flashed across the national television. Prison numbers appeared on the screen that should have never been. Producers began to see them not as reliable hit makers, but as a problem. That wasn't a one-off mistake. It was a pattern that followed the band everywhere they went. To understand why Madness behaved like this on Britain's biggest music show, you have to look back to where it came from, long before the suits, the hits, and the cameras arrived. For most British pop groups in the early 1980s, an appearance on Top of the Pops was not optional. It was essential. The programme regularly drew audiences of more than 50 million viewers and functioned as the country's main gateway between the charts and the public. A strong performance could turn a rising single into a national hit within days. A weak appearance could stall momentum just as quickly. For a band like Madness, whose success depended constantly on visibility during a run of rapid chart releases between 1979 and 1983, maintaining a good relationship with the BBC mattered more than almost anything else. Yet from early on, producers began to notice that Madness did not behave like the other chart acts invited onto the programme. While most performers treated the studio as a controlled broadcast environment, Madness treated it more like an extension of their stage shows. Visual jokes appeared instead of dancing, props appeared unexpectedly, clothing sometimes carried messages that had not been cleared in advance. The tone was playful from the band's perspective, but from the BBC's point of view, it created a risk during live transmission. That tension became visible in one appearance when a concealed shirt bearing the message "I need the BBC like a hole in the head" was revealed on air. The moment lasted only seconds, but it was enough to alarm producers responsible for keeping the programme suitable for a family audience. In another broadcast, members displayed placards referencing prison identification numbers connected to the people they knew, again introducing material that had not been approved before transmission. Individually, these incidents might have been dismissed as isolated jokes. Together, they created a reputation. Inside the BBC, Madness began to be viewed not simply as energetic performers, but as unpredictable guests. Temporary exclusions from appearances followed. For a band still climbing the charts, it was an unusually risky position to be in, and it raised a larger question about why they behaved so differently from the other pop acts around them. By the early 1980s, appearances on Top of the Pops followed a predictable routine. Performances were rehearsed carefully, clothing was checked in advance, and artists were expected to treat the studio as a controlled broadcast space, rather than a live concert environment. Most chart acts understood that even a small surprise could create problems for producers responsible for a nationwide family audience. Madness did not approach the programme that way. Instead, their performances often carried the same energy that defined their stage shows. Visual gags appeared without warning, props slipped into the shot, messages hidden in clothing were revealed only once cameras were already rolling. From the band's perspective, this is part of their humour and identity. From the BBC's perspective, it introduced uncertainty into the programme, watched all across England. After the concealed t-shirt incident and the placard references linked to prison identification numbers, producers began treating Madness differently from other performers. Booking them was no longer routine. It became a judgmental call. Temporary exclusions followed, not because the band had broken a formal rule once, but because the pattern suggested future broadcasts might carry similar surprises. For a programme built on predictability, that really mattered. The situation was unusual because Madness were not just struggling newcomers testing boundaries for publicity. At the time, they were already one of the most visible British groups in the charts, releasing a steady run of successful singles and maintaining a strong nation following. Television exposure normally reinforced that success. In their case, it began to complicate it. Inside the BBC, their reputation shifted from energetic performers to unreliable live guests. Outside the BBC, however, the same behaviour strengthened their image as authentic outsiders who had not adapted themselves to television expectations. That contrast raises a more important question. Madness were not trying to provoke broadcasters for its own sake. Their humour, their presentation, and their refusal to behave like conventional pop acts came from somewhere earlier, and somewhere much closer to home. Long before they were appearing on Top of the Pops, the members of Madness were growing up around Camden Town and nearby Kentish Town in North London. In the early 1970s, this was not the creative destination it would later become. It was a working class district shaped by council estates, unemployment, football terrace rivalries, and a tightly bonded neighbourhood friendships. For many teenagers in the area, the identity came from the street you lived on and the people you grew up alongside. Madness formed inside that environment rather than escaping it. Before they were musicians, they were simply a group of local friends who spent their time moving through the same estates, schools and youth clubs. Suggs later described the band feeling like an extension of being in a gang, not because they were organised criminals, but because loyalty and humour worked the same way. You stuck together, defended each other, and developed a shared language that outsiders often didn't understand. Several members had minor run-ins with trouble while growing up. Suggs was arrested for a fray as a teenager. Lee Thompson appeared in court just 11 years old for burglary. Others were involved in graffiti and low-level vandalism that was common among North London youths at the time. None of this was unusual in Camden's street culture, but it shaped how they saw authority and how comfortable they felt ignoring it later on in television. Even their nickname, the Nutty Boys, existed before fame arrived. It reflected how they were already known locally, loud, unpredictable, and impossible to control in formal settings. When eventually stepped onto national television, they didn't just adopt a rebellious image for publicity. They simply behaved the same way they always had. That authenticity helped explain why the BBC struggled to manage them, but also explained something else. The audience that first recognised Madness as their own came from exactly the same streets they did. As Madness began moving from local venues in North London to national television, they brought more of their human and Camden identity with them. They also brought the audiences that had supported them from the very beginning. In the late 1970s, the audience included large numbers of second-wave skinhead revival fans, young working-class listeners drawn to ska music, sharp suits and the same street culture as the band themselves came from. Originally, skinhead culture in Britain had outgrown of multicultural London neighbourhoods during the late 1960s. It was closely tied with Jamaican ska and reggae, and many early followers were part of a mixed community shaped by music rather than politics. Madness fit naturally into that environment. Their sound owed a clear depth to artists like Prince Buster, and their appearance, cropped hair, loafers, braces and tailored suits, matched what their early fans already wore. At first, this was nothing controversial about the connection at all. The problem emerged as the skinhead movement changed during the late 1970s. By the time Madness were entering the charts, part of the scene had begun to fragment. Some groups remained focused on music and fashion. Others became associated with nationalist imagery that alarmed journalists and broadcasters. When reporters began noticing these symbols appearing in crowds at Madness concerts, the band's image started to shift in the press. Suddenly, they were no longer just Camden musicians with a loyal following. They were being described as a group attracting the wrong kind of audience. This was a difficult position to be in for the band. Madness themselves had not adopted political messages, and their music drew heavily from black Jamaican influences. Yet their reluctance to make strong public statements early on allowed assumptions to spread. For a time, the association followed them into interviews, television appearances, and coverage of their chart success. It complicated how they were understood nationally, even as their popularity continued to grow. In many ways, the controversy explained why the broadcasters had already been cautious around them. The unpredictable behaviour on television now seemed to fit a wider narrative forming around the group. Madness were not just energetic performers from Camden anymore. They were becoming one of the most misunderstood bands in Britain's pop landscape. By the early 1980s, growing association between Madness and a section of the skinhead revival scene had become difficult to ignore. It wasn't just something the band had created deliberately, but it was something that they now had to address. As their audience expanded beyond North London and into the national charts, they began to realise that silence on the issue allowed others to define their image for them. The same humour and unpredictability that had unsettled television producers were now being interpreted as signs that they simply didn't take controversy seriously. Their response did not come through press conferences or public statements. Instead, it appeared on their songwriting. One of the clearest examples was Embarrassment, a track that told the story of a family reacting badly to an interracial relationship. Rather than presenting politics directly, the song explored prejudice through everyday life, in the same way many of their earlier lyrics explored school, neighbourhood arguments, and working class routines. It showed that Madness were willing to confront uncomfortable subjects, but on their own terms. Later, songs like Waiting for the Ghost Train made their position even clearer by criticising apartheid in South Africa. These were not just gestures of the band aligned with extremist audiences. These were signals that Madness understood how they were being perceived and were quietly reshaping that perception through music instead of interviews. At the same time, their popularity was changing in the composition of their audiences. As singles such as Our House reached a broader mainstream public, The image of Madness as a strictly North London street band began to fade. They were no longer performing only to the crowd that had first followed them through local venues. Families were buying their records, television viewers who had never been near Camden were learning their lyrics. The misunderstanding that once surrounded them did not disappear overnight, but it became harder to sustain. Ironically, the very qualities that had caused the problems with broadcasters in the first place, authenticity, humour and loyalty in their roots, were now helping them outgrow the label that had followed them since their earliest concerts. Once the background of Madness became clearer, the clashes atop the Pops no longer looked like an isolated moments of mischief. They were a visible result of a band that carried its Camden identity directly onto national television, without changing how it behaved. What producers saw as unpredictability was, from the band's perspective, simply normal behaviour, transplanted into an unfamiliar environment. Most chart acts of the early 1980s adjusted themselves to television expectations. Madness did not. Their humour remained the same as it had been in new clubs and rehearsal rooms. Their loyalty to one another still resembled the tight group culture they had formed growing up in Camden Town. Even their stage image reflected the local street styles that had first attracted their earliest audiences. Nothing about them had been redesigned for broadcasting. This is what made the BBC incidents so unusual. They weren't publicity stunts planned by a management team. They were spontaneous expressions of a group that had never learned to separate performance from personality. Same authenticity that helped Madness connect with the working class listeners also made them difficult for television producers to manage. In the end, the tension between Madness and national broadcasters revealed something larger than a few controversial appearances. It showed the gap between a tightly controlled pop industry and a band that had arrived from outside it. Madness hadn't set out to challenge the rules of British television. They simply brought Camden with them, and for a while, the BBC didn't quite know what to do with that.